If you've had the misfortune of spending any time in an emergency department in the United States, first of all, I'm sorry. Sorry, of course, for the reason that you were there in the first place, but also sorry because of the experience that you likely had. Now, I'm betting that if you went to a typical emergency department in a medium to large size city, you find yourself having to wait to see a provider a lot longer than you probably expected. Unless, of course, if you arrive with a life threatening emergency, in which case I hope you were seen immediately. But I know that isn't necessarily true either. So, just to give you an example, about a year ago, I was working in our hospital's outpatient wound clinic. And I'm going to tell you this story because it's a true one and it still bothers me to this day. But so I say it's an outpatient wound clinic. The wound clinic is actually within the hospital. Now, most of my wound care patients have a long list of underlying medical issues from diabetes to peripheral vascular disease. Many are bedridden. Some have to be transported to my clinic by wheelchair van or by stretcher. Some attend dialysis 3 days a week. Some are paraplegic or quadriplegic from things like prior gunshot wounds or motor vehicle accidents or other trauma. In any case, you get the idea that many of my wound care patients are baseline very sick patients. On the other hand, some are otherwise able to drive themselves to clinic, and aside from some restrictions on life due to their non-healing wounds, they can live a pretty normal life. So one day in clinic, one of my patients, who is able to drive himself to clinic and is otherwise a fairly active guy, he's got some known coronary artery disease, but he arrived at clinic looking just really gray. I mean, I really get to know most of my wound care patients pretty well because most of them, I see them weekly, sometimes for months, even years. And this particular patient, I'll call him Dan, it's not his real name, but he just didn't look well. He was ashen. He had a really worried look on his face. And I immediately asked him, I said, what's wrong? And he proceeded to tell me that he was having some chest pain, some chest discomfort, and some left shoulder pain. And he had absolutely no energy. So my emergency department instincts had already kicked in, and I knew that this was an impending medical emergency. The clinic nurses, almost all of them really have been former ICU or ED nurses. They all had the same sense. And so we didn't waste a lot of time with Dan, and we got him ready for quick transport up to the emergency department. His vital signs were stable. The nurses began rolling him out of clinic towards the elevator and the long hallway trek to the emergency department. I mean, he wasn't ready to cardiac arrest on me, so we didn't call a rapid response, but in hindsight, I probably should have. Because if I did call a rapid response, what followed might not have happened. But per our protocol, when sending someone to the emergency department, I called our transfer center, which is like a clearinghouse for all patients going to the ED from clinic as well as from outlying emergency departments and doctor's offices and so on. I gave the transfer center the patient info and the presenting problem, but I knew not much of that detail would be passed along by the transfer center to the ED charge nurse. So since I also work in the emergency department, I called one of the attending physicians currently working in the ED, and I let her know the problem and my concern and the patient's history, and that I think he may be experiencing acute coronary syndrome, or ACS. Okay, message received, and they would be looking for him. My wound clinic nurses returned, and they told me that he had to be wheeled to the intake registration desk per the charge nurse up there because they didn't have any available space for him when he arrived. I wasn't too surprised about that. I mean, we often have half of our emergency department occupied by boarders. Boarders are patients who are admitted to the hospital but don't have a bed to go to, so they stay in the emergency department, sometimes for days before a bed becomes available. I nevertheless wasn't too worried. I knew that my communication had been received and my clinical concerns had been relayed. Plus, I'm a colleague and not one to just overreact. So anyway, I went about my day of seeing the rest of my wound clinic patients. And typically a day in the wound clinic is pretty busy, debriding wounds, placing skin substitutes, placental tissue, neonatal foreskin, all sorts of high-tech products and dressings on some pretty challenging wounds. My clinic days are, like I said, they're pretty busy, and by the time I'm done, I'm usually ready to get out of there. And I never looked at the status board of the ED, just out of curiosity to see how my patient was faring up in the ED. I should have, but I didn't. I know that there are some doctors and PAs and nurse practitioners who are really, really good about following up with their patients. I wish I could say that I'm one of them, but not always. Sometimes, but not always. I have other things going on, which is not really an excuse, but I did really expect the ED to take good care of my patient. The following week, my patient, Dan, didn't show up for clinic. So I looked him up on the computer and quickly found out that he was admitted to the hospital from the week prior. I didn't have much time to review the chart beyond that, though, until the end of my workday in clinic. And that's when I found out what really had happened. My patient, who I had clearly communicated was a high likelihood ACS or acute coronary syndrome, had sat in the waiting room of the ED for nearly 12 hours before being seen by a provider around midnight. By 1 a.m., he was in the cath lab getting stents put in his coronary artery for a greater than 90% occlusion of his left anterior descending coronary artery. That's main coronary artery. Dan was lucky to survive, and that goes without saying. Fortunately for him, it all turned out well, and because he's a quiet and a soft-spoken guy, he never spoke up as he sat in the waiting room hour after hour. He was appreciative of the care that he received, and he did receive great care once it was recognized why he was there. Dan wasn't the only one sitting and waiting half a day to be seen. At that time, others were waiting with all sorts of complaints, abdominal pains, and you name it. But I just don't know what happened in Dan's case. I did not file a request to have the case audited, and I probably should have. I did not call a rapid response in the wound clinic because I didn't believe that he was in imminent cardiac arrest, but if I had escalated my response, he might have been brought directly to an ED bed and care would have been started 12 hours sooner. I also didn't take the time to look him up while I was in the wound clinic seeing patients. If I had, I would have noticed that he was still waiting to be seen, and I would have been able to call up to the ED and see what the delay was. This is an example of how all of us not doing our best or trying to do our best, but maybe not working out that way. I don't know. In any case, it's not intentional. Dan, my patient, was sent to the right place. He arrived with a complaint that usually would set off alarms in people's heads that he needs an immediate EKG and labs, etc. I can only guess that the dynamic environment of the ED sometimes distracts us, and even the sickest can sometimes get lost in the mix. My takeaway point is this, that you have to be your own advocate as a patient. If you have someone in the ED with you, let them also advocate for you. If you're believing that you're waiting too long, say something. I ask that you be polite about it because everyone is human and we all know what type of reaction an impolite request gets. Usually not what you want. So be polite, but be persistent. I do believe that the cliche, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, is true. Our healthcare system is in dire straits. It's beyond broken. And please understand, I don't believe it's broken necessarily in the emergency department and not amongst the individual staff. Everyone that shows up to work every day really is trying to do their best to care for everyone. Our ED nurses and techs and providers are there to help. It's the system that we now work in that makes it, I don't know, sometimes near impossible to do the job that we used to do just a few years ago. And I say this as someone who's worked in the emergency department for most of my nearly 30 years as an NP, not to mention the decades that I've spent as a paramedic. My patient Dan survived despite what happened, and he remains my wound care patient to this day. His heart has healed much faster than his chronic wounds, even though I'm still trying my best. I look forward to reading your comments regarding this story. And I'm sure many of you, whether you're a patient or a healthcare provider, have similar stories to tell. I think that increasing our awareness that healthcare is in bad shape everywhere will prompt us to kind of join together and demand change. The question is, where do we demand it from? That still is unclear to me. But through sharing stories like this, I think we can get to an answer, and hopefully soon. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.